Hello, and welcome to Technically Speaking, a podcast where scientists and engineers come together to chat about a common interest, share knowledge, and satisfy some curiosity. I'm Laura, and in this episode, I'm joined by Aneeqa and hopefully a few others to talk about risk, what it means to us, and how we handle it in our various professions. So, Aneeqa, what does risk mean to you?
Um, I guess risk, I don't know, we talk about it all the time, but it's so hard to define. Um, for me, I think it's like things that could happen that we have to be aware of when we're planning our activities day to day. I guess that's the simplest way that I would describe it.
Fair enough. So you work in a lab, right?
Yeah, so I do research in nuclear fusion. I don't actually work with a lot of active samples, but I still work in labs with heavy machinery and kind of materials and large components and stuff like that. So yeah, when we're in labs, we always have to do risk assessments when we're planning experiments and things like that. So that's kind of a risk in day to day. And because I work at a university, they also make you do risk assessments for every kind of process as well. So one example is that one of my students needed a chair to work from home. And that was one of my most recent risk assessments, was writing a risk assessment to receive a chair at home. But there are risks, and the university can't be liable in case you hurt your back when you're handling a chair, or you catch COVID from the delivery driver. So I had to have things like stay 2 meters away from the delivery, leave the box to quarantine for like I don't know, I wrote maybe 72 hours, and then then you can construct your chair and be careful when lifting heavy components and things like that. But yeah, it's a super kind of common activity that we have to do is making risk assessments.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess a lot of the time you do a risk assessment without thinking about it pretty much in day-to-day life as well, I guess. I mean, you've probably heard me talk about this before, but a good example is crossing the road, isn't it? Where like obviously you check to see if there's any traffic and you check to see if it makes sense to cross where you are, and if not, you find another place like a crossing rather than just walking straight out onto the road. So yeah.
Yeah, there's so many risks all around us, and I think some of them are acceptable to us and some of them aren't acceptable. And then when they're not acceptable, we have to put measures in place to mitigate against them. So like when you cross the road, it's probably not acceptable to cross it when there's loads of traffic coming. So we put measures in place, like having a pedestrian crossing where someone can safely cross the road when cars can stop and stuff like that.
Yeah, so the risk assessment you were talking about, so with getting a chair delivered, how does that differ to a risk assessment that you would do if you were working in the lab, or is it exactly the same?
So the actual risk assessment, like the piece of paper, is the same piece of paper. So the whole thought process behind it is the same. But obviously in the lab, it's different what we kind of things. Well, some of them are actually the same. Like lifting heavy stuff is a pretty common one in labs. But then there's other specific risks to certain chemicals or certain things that you might use. And for that, then you have to look at procedures and databases and make sure you're following best practice to try and keep the risk as low as reasonably possible in the lab.
Okay. So like some of the risk assessments I've done in the past, you have like a matrix, sort of a 5x5 table. Apparently waving your arms around with a podcast doesn't work very well. I'll try and remember not to do
Keep
that in
nodding,
the
and then I
future.
realized that you can't hear nothing.
But yeah, it's sort of like you multiply the chance of it happening, the probability of something happening by the consequences of if that thing were to happen, what would it be? So like the most extreme is you will definitely die from doing this activity. In an hour lab, that's like a 5 and a 5. So it's on the probability scale, it's a 5, and the consequences scale, it's a 5 as well. And then we use sort of those numbers to figure out what sort of mitigation you have to put in place to make it even safer. Do you guys do that as well?
Yeah. So we put mitigations in place. So we either, like, if it's too dangerous, we just don't do the activity. If there's no mitigations you can put in place, or it's not safe for someone to do it, then you don't do it. But otherwise, yeah, we put mitigations in place and try and reduce that number as much as possible. But obviously things can still happen, and not all risks are taken into account. So we're joined by a silent civil engineer today, who lost their voice during their work, having to teach for 3.5 hours constantly. So you could argue that that's a risk, that you could lose your voice if you're having to talk for 3.5 hours straight on Zoom. But no one carried out a risk assessment for that, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm getting a shaking head because they can't speak, but yeah.
I guess there are also like two different kind of consequences there, because there's the physical effect, the health effect. There's also like, I guess you can't really do your job anymore if your job all revolves around speaking and talking to students. How are you meant to do your next lecture? So yeah, I think a lot of the time we talk about risk as being like the physical effect. But I guess like project managers would think about it as, oh, the risk of like project failure or
Yeah.
something similar.
Absolutely, I think both of them, yeah, the effect of the project and then the effect to your own well-being as well. But I think because you work in nuclear as well, right, Laura? So in nuclear, I think that's a really interesting way of like how risk is managed. So like I remember when I was at uni that there's like different kind of, I don't know if a project management approach is the right word, but it's like you identify the risk and then you have to reduce the risk. So if you're working with active material, that might be like shielding or things like that to reduce the dose that you're receiving. But then there were a few other ones which I can't remember them as well now. But it's like if a system fails, you need to have another one in place. So say you've got the shielding, but say something happened to that shielding, you need to have another one just in case. I can't remember the word for it. There's a special word.
Redundancy, I think.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
That's the word.
Thanks. Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. Yeah, I remember this from, so I used to be a nuclear safety assessor many, many years ago. So I used to do this professionally. And yeah, if depending on what the consequences were, and like the final risk level, once you'd multiplied your consequences by the probability, that would then dictate how many control measures you had to put in place. So yeah, you'd have like a secondary backup. I think nuclear calls it like defense in depth, having all these redundant systems. Which sounds a bit weird in a way, saying something's redundant.
But it's so important. Like, yeah, if something like, I think, was it with them? Yeah, I can't remember what it was, but you know, just having different levels in place is, if one doesn't work, having another one just to catch issues is very, very useful.
Yeah. So we've talked a bit about like crossing roads and things. So what's the most risky thing that you've ever done, either professionally or at home? You might not want to answer that actually.
Good question. I think it's really hard because maybe we didn't know something we did was risky as well, right? Because you only know if something's risky if like either if something bad happens to you, or if it doesn't happen to you. How do you know you weren't just lucky? And like if you weren't aware that the risk was there, that's, I'm sure I've done that plenty of times. I've done really, especially as a kid. I'm sure I almost died several times, but I just wasn't aware of the risk. Like once I remember when I was a kid, I climbed a tree, like in flip-flops, all the way to the top and fell like on, and the tree was on top of concrete. So if I'd been young and done a risk, like if I'd done a risk assessment at that time, I'd be like, that's not wise to climb a tree in flip-flops, which is above concrete. But I'm like, no, I'm going to do this. So I climbed the tree and I got to the top and then I fell all the way down. But luckily, little Aneeqa was a bit chubby and got stuck hanging upside down over the concrete in the tree. And then like my brothers, they went to get my mom and my mom didn't believe them that like her daughter could be so stupid to be stuck in a tree. And then she just came like 5 minutes later with a cricket bat. To this day, I thought, okay, if I've not died from falling from the tree, my mom is now going to kill me with this cricket bat for being so naughty. I don't know what she planned to do, whether it was to hit me or to like poke me out of the tree. But that was a pretty risky thing that I did. But I've survived and you know, I'm alive to this day. But at the time, I wasn't aware it was risky. So you know, I think being aware is a big part of risk. Sorry, I rambled a lot about my childhood experience.
No, that was very entertaining. I can't stop laughing about that now. Yeah, it's a good point though. Like if you'd have known if it were risky, you probably wouldn't have done it in the first place, right? But then,
or maybe I would have, because I was quite foolish. Like I did a lot of foolish things as a child. I don't know. Like I think a lot of, I don't know, are children aware of risks? Because we have to like tell them, right? Like to don't touch this, don't do that, that's hot, don't jump here and there. But then it's a balance between like instilling fear in them of not trying something, but then also not hurting themselves severely as well.
Yeah, so we were talking about this sort of perception of risk, weren't we? I mean, you said, yeah, I work in the nuclear industry. I work with nuclear waste, and a lot of people kind of think that's quite a risky thing. Like, well, I'm still around. And I think part of the reason people think it's risky is because they don't really know what it is and how we handle it and how you can handle it safely. It comes across in like the public consciousness as this awful thing that should be avoided at all costs, but it's kept out of the public domain because that's the safest way of handling it, to do it in a controlled way, right? Which then creates this almost mythology around it.
And I
So
think because the nuclear industry does put so much procedures in place, like to mitigate against risk and to avoid like serious incidents, that actually like puts more fear in, I think, public perception in a way, just because they see all of these things that, oh, why are they having to do all of this? If it's safe to use, why are people putting all of these things in place? Whereas I actually think it's a positive thing that that they're so open and transparent, that they have all of these procedures in place and they do all of this stuff, because so many other industries we don't hear about all the like risks that they might have, whether that's like fossil fuels or other like, I don't know, mining industries, things like that are really risky, but we don't hear about all of those things that might happen as a result, or the procedures that have been put in place, because they're just not as open, I think.
yeah, I think I suppose it's quite difficult to get across how risky something is if it's quite a difficult thing to talk about anyway. Like, so the nuclear industry is quite complicated, right? And like you can't see radiation, you can't sense it unless you have some other sensor. But then like the same is true of the gas that we pipe into our own houses to heat them, to run the boiler. You can only detect that, you can only smell it because a scent was put into it. Otherwise, you wouldn't know if there were a leak. You wouldn't be able to sense it unless you had some other equipment. But it's a difficult thing to get across, isn't it? I think people say when they smell gas, they don't think, well, that's actually the smell that's put into it. And it's the same in nuclear. You can't sense radiation unless you've got some other device. Or radiation makes a lot of things glow, doesn't it? So we're all caught in something that luminesced when it was exposed to radiation. Maybe we can get around it that way.
Radiation's all around us as well, right? So it's not radiation that's dangerous, it's the amount of radiation. So like if you eat a banana, that contains radiation. Or if you go to the hospital because you've hurt yourself and you need an x-ray, that would actually, if you didn't have that x-ray, that would hinder the doctors. So it's, small amounts of radiation are, okay for us and safe, and they actually can be really beneficial to our lives. Like bananas are really, not because of the radiation, but bananas are good for us. And x-rays help doctors find broken bones and things like that. Oh yeah, if you're allergic to a banana, they're not so good. That's true. But yeah, so it's all about the quantities as well, and it goes back to that table you said about like finding probabilities of things as well. So it's like the probability and the severity of the consequence, and those two things put together, I think they make the risk.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, all the years I've been working with radiation, I'm pretty sure I get more of a radiation dose from like a single transatlantic flight than I do from my day job. And like the space radiation, the radiation that comes from space when I'm in a plane is taken into account when the risk assessment is done for the other things that I do. So you can kind of see how it becomes more complicated to figure out what the effects would actually be to someone that doesn't necessarily know as much about it. So I guess that's why the perception is that it's quite a risky thing. But when you come to understand it and you learn the details, it suddenly seems you're a lot more comfortable with it, I guess. The same is true of piping gas into your house or crossing a road or lots of things we do in everyday life. I think one of the most risky things I did at home was working on my household electrics. I can't quite remember what I was doing, but I'd unscrewed a plug socket from the wall. I might have been painting behind it or something, or painting around it and not wanting to get paint everywhere. And I think something might have gotten stuck in it and I was trying to get it out, and I had completely forgotten to isolate the circuit before I started working on it. So, working on live electrics, not a good idea because electrocution is death.
Yeah.
So definitely more risky than some of the things I've done in the lab, which was just a lapse in concentration, I think.
Yeah. And I think that's why we need all of these risk assessments and stuff as well, right? Because we're humans, so it's so easy for humans to make mistakes. So when you have to like stop and think about things, then at least you're like aware these are the the dangers.
Yeah, and I guess you have to get that balance right, as you were saying, like how do you teach children about risk, or do they just inherently pick it up? You don't want to go too far and constrain people too much and make them afraid to do anything. Yeah, I was reading an article just recently about, have you heard of a micromort?
No.
No, it's a measure of what's the official definition? So it's your chances in a million of being killed by doing a particular activity. So your 1 in 1,000 chance of being killed by sitting on a chair is just over 1.3 micromorts. Risk of death by sitting on a chair, because you could fall off it and injure yourself in a way that you will die. Apparently.
No way. I'm sitting on a chair right now.
Well, there you go. It didn't say what kind of chair. I don't know if it's safer because it has arms and whatever else. You did a risk assessment for a chair, right?
Yeah, to be fair, going back to my old for my student who had to make a risk assessment for a chair delivery. That I didn't know about that. There's a whole unit for that. That's really crazy.
Yeah,
that you can quantify that.
I think it's based on, like, statistically, like, I guess how many people have been admitted to hospital as a result of falling off a chair and then died or something like that. I don't actually know, to be honest. I need to look into it a bit more to know how it's calculated. But yeah, there's loads of stuff, like the risk of death from driving a car 400 kilometers is approximately a micromort as well. So roughly the same as sitting in a chair. Climbing Mount Everest seems really risky. 40,000 micromorts per ascent. It's not a surprise from some of the documentaries I've seen, though.
Yeah, to be fair, I haven't seen I watched the movie Everest, and I was like, don't plan to be climbing any Himalayan mountains.
Well, no, but then you've seen one movie and assumed it's really, really dangerous, right? But that movie obviously portrays it in a certain way.
That is true.
So yeah,
but now I've got the data that backs it up. It's 40,000 micromorts.
Yeah, you'll stay sitting in my chair.
Yeah, that's safer. Only one. I can sit on my chair 40,000 times, and it's the same as climbing Everest. Yeah. Wow, I should do that as like an activity. I'm climbing Everest. I'm staying on my chair 40,000 times.
Oh dear. On that bombshell, I think we've been talking for quite a while now.
Can we answer one question? We've had the questions sent in the chat.
Okay.
So I think just let's try this interactive question type thing in case like we have viewers in the future who send in questions.
Oh yeah, like live Twitter questions. Yeah, go for it.
So the question in the chat from Rahma is, do you ever feel risk assessments holds your work back, and do you get frustrated by it even though it's so useful?
I would say no, because it makes you sit down and think about the work and actually plan it out and figure out the best way of doing it. But then I guess sometimes I do feel like all the safety procedures you have to go through do seem a bit onerous. I guess that you'd then have to think about, is the risk assessment really appropriate for the work that you're doing? But I think if I hadn't been trained in how to do risk assessments and spent an awful lot of time working with potentially risky things, but in a safe way, I don't think I would have translated that into doing things at home. So, working on my household electrics or riding my mountain bike, which apparently is quite a risky thing. I think I would probably do that in probably a more dangerous way if I wasn't aware of how useful risk assessments are. What about you?
I don't think they've ever held my work back, to be honest. It can be frustrating when you're doing it for like a chair, like that kind of stuff I do find frustrating, because I feel then you're just jumping through hoops, because sometimes people are writing risk assessments and it's just there for liability purposes and things like that, and you're like, are people actually thinking about what they're doing? Does it still hold that same value? And then I think that can be a bit dangerous if people just think, oh, it's just a risk assessment, I don't need to know what's in there and stuff, because actually they are really important, even for other things, because if you don't follow them, then you're not aware of dangers, which, especially if you're responsible for other people, I think can be really important. So I haven't felt that they've held my work back. Sometimes I can get frustrated when it is on something that I think is trivial or mundane, that might kind of go against like the bigger picture of because sometimes it goes the other way, right? They're like, you have to do like all of this stuff just so something bad doesn't happen to you, but then doing all of those things might induce more, like, dangers into your life. Like, so for the same chair, what a great example. Who knew chairs would be great examples for risk? So initially I would have bought it because universities have set suppliers or whatever. So the first supplier I bought it from, they're like, we can't deliver it to your home because like in case someone buys other things from us, like chemicals or whatever, and delivers it to their home, we have a no home delivery policy even for a chair. They're like, but we can send it to the university and you can pick it up. But I'm like, no, that's the point, that we're not allowed in the university at the moment and my student doesn't have a chair, so I can't send it to the university for the student to go to university to get a chair to bring it home, because otherwise he could have just gone to university and found a chair in any old building and brought it home in the first place. The point was that he can't go and he has to get it delivered to home. So sometimes, like, I don't know whether it's like bureaucracy or whatever, so even though that's because of the risk, that forced us to then buy it from somewhere else and things like that. So in that example, that company lost business of a chair because of the risk assessment of that. We can't let people deliver stuff to their home. But yeah, sorry, I don't know if that made sense. But
no, it did. I think the take-home message was risk assessments are useful, but they have to be done in an appropriate manner. So the mitigation has to be proportional to the risk, the consequences that are entailed. And it's daft to apply a blanket risk assessment to everything.
Yeah. I think I couldn't put it better myself. That was a really nice way of putting it, I think.
Yeah, cool. Well, I think we've reached the end of everything we have to say about risk. So I guess we will end the podcast here.